Oh, sorry, I'm getting some feedback to this. If you're, could you put yourself on mute? Sorry. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Nothing worse than hearing yourself talking back to yourself. It would be good to get questions as we're going through. So if people want to put them in the chat or whatever, we can try and talk about it as we go through. But I will leave some time at the end, and hopefully we can just have an open discussion about what inclusive agile means to you and kind of the different things that people have started to try to make their kind of agile teams a bit more inclusive. So if you go on to the next slide, please. Just to kind of set some context then, I'm going to talk about inclusion and about how we kind of build that into agile adoption. I'm not going to talk about how to change the ways of working in your organisation overnight. And everything I'm talking about is just my experience and my opinion. It's no right or wrong way. It's just what I've found when I've been working with some of the teams. I'm going to kind of really talk about this through what's happened to me this year and how I've been involved in quite an ambitious change programme and really where we've got to with that and what we've applied as we've went through. I suppose I hope by the end of the session that you can leave with something that you could change in your teams to help be a bit more inclusive with your teams, and that when you do that, the small changes make a big impact. So I can't promise you that we'll smash silos overnight, but I think we can all certainly look at how we can chip away at them as we go through next year. If you could go on to the next slide, please. Just to start with a little bit about myself, to really set that context. So first and foremost, I'm a mum and I'm a wife. My family are my motivation, so everything I do for them. And I've actually, one of the positives out of lockdown for me has been around for things like breakfast before school or the after school chats before people start their homework and all that sort of thing. And I've actually found that to be quite inclusive. So rather than having to separate my work and home life completely, I've been able to find quite a nice balance. And it's led me to think about the different circumstances that people have and that people are working around in order to support themselves and their families or their other commitments. But when I'm not at work, as Gary said, I'm the head of delivery for the wealth advice part of it. Advice business. I provide the technologies to enable our financial advice partners to do their jobs and helps implement new technologies in order to make advice more accessible for everyone. And again, that's another theme through this year. We've been looking at how do we make advice accessible, because quite often it's not accessible unless you have got money behind you. I've learned quite a lot about agile delivery just on the job. So very, very little of it's been kind of formal training, but I've been an advocate ever since I started learning about it, and that was part of what I was talking about at the start. Know people from way back when I was at student loans, when I started to learn about agile, and really it's just a way I like to work. But what I have learned is, for me, it's about how you adapt it to the environment you're working in. So I've worked in public sector, I've worked in a startup environment, and now financial services, which is quite heavily governed. So we need to think about how we work with what we have and kind of challenge and change the things that we can and just chip away at the ways of working until we can get our teams into the place that's good for them. I also have an interest in diversity and inclusion, and I work within the technology director at M&G and look at how we can be more diverse and how we can increase our inclusion. So I'm trying very hard to be an ally. I say trying because you're never going to be perfect at it, but it's something that's certainly at front of mind for me all of the time. But basically, I think the secret is people are people, no matter where they're working. We have to remember that everyone's got their own things going on. So I think we just need to think about how we make our workplaces a bit more inclusive and what types of inclusivity we have and what impact that can have on our everyday. So if you want to go on to the next slides, please, Gary. I've got a couple of stats about diversity and inclusion. Now, these are just kind of plucked from various things I've been reading, but basically the bottom line is diverse teams are more successful, and diversity I've thought is very important. When we talk about inclusion, we're talking about how well contributions are valued and integrated into an environment. And when we talk about diversity, we're talking about representation within that. So I think for me, it's not about grand sweeping gestures. Every small thing you do matters. And if you look at that, you can see by the numbers how things shift. So things like if you've got more female board directors, you get higher financial performance within the company. Or the one at the bottom, and it says executive teams ranking in the top 25% for racial and ethnic diversity are 33% more likely to get financial returns above the national median for their industries. What this is showing is it doesn't matter what type of diversity and inclusion you're looking at, it makes a massive difference. Having a team that's all female, for example, is no more diverse than a team that's all male. It's how you. So if we can go on to the next slide, I'll take you back to kind of where I've started this year, and I'll come back to the diversity and inclusion theme as we talk through it. So I said I'd set this in context of my year and what I've done. And at the end of last year, my boss came to me and said, I've got an opportunity for you, you know, the type of conversation that happens all the time, and I still haven't learned that lesson. So I was like, oh, what is it? And I'd just spent the last 2 years working on a big product launch. We'd had remote teams. We'd really introduced agile ways of working to those teams, and we had worked across lots of different geographies, and it'd been a massive challenge, but it was very successful. So basically, it was like, I'd like to go and repeat that, but in a different part of our business. We had a very large, complex delivery that was coming up, and we wanted to scale the capacity of the teams that we had, but equally we had to maintain a service, and we had to look at how we could adopt the new agile ways of working. So basically, our senior leaders had seen what's happened in the delivery I'd just finished and wanted a bit of it for their part of the business. So it's about how do we start to think about scaling, going faster, and delivering in an agile manner. Now, in the second year of a pandemic, what could possibly be difficult about that above and beyond what would normally be? So, of course, I jumped at the chance, and that was where I started my year. So I moved into our advice part of our business. If you go on to the next slide. The first thing I had to think about in January was, well, where do I start? It's very, very easy to jump in and do I know what to do. My last team worked like this. We did it this way over there, but we all know that's not the right way to approach anything. So I listened to a lot of people and I stayed objective. And what this slide shows is really just the main themes that were coming out. And the teams had different ways of thinking about it. Some of them were excited, some of them were quite cynical. Some of them were just too busy. They're like, we don't need to change, we're just busy, we just need to get stuff done. And then there was a trust piece. So what I did find is that there was a big silo had formed between technology and our business units. And it was a bit of a them and us culture. But equally, we had silos within our silos. So even within our IT function, we had different silos, or within our business units, we had silos. So we really had to look at how do we get ourselves to be one team, all pulling in the same direction, and really kind of build up some trust between people. So I did a lot of conversation, like the conversation at the start was, it's difficult to coach when you're remote. That was exactly it. It was booking appointments, let's meet for a coffee, let's have a quick chat about what you think, which did make it slightly artificial, but it was the best that we could do in the circumstances, and it just let me gather all the information I needed. And what was clear at the end of the day was they were doing. So this was going to be a change process for everybody, and we had to do a bit of a reset, bring everyone along with us. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. My job really was about starting to set some expectations. So we had to build in some time for learning and a bit of time for just being safe and create an environment where people could ask questions and feel safe to learn. So we talked about what was the adoption timescale going to look like? Everyone wants everything to happen overnight, but we set that expectation, which was this year was all about how do we want to work and start moving towards that. And next year is about how do we stabilise that way of working. So the portfolio I came from last year had probably spent about 2 or 3 years establishing and stabilising and maturing, and they were in a bit of a regular delivery cadence by the time that we left, which is great, but you're not going to be able to do that while getting lots of new people in overnight. So we set some expectations there, and equally we set that within the delivery timescales. So we weren't going to triple the amount of change that we would deliver overnight. There was going to be a lot of hard work, and we were going to need a lot of support. And the main thing I kind of found was you don't know how people respond to change, so you have to kind of build that in. Now, being in financial services, and I mentioned it now, and I don't want anyone rolling their eyes, but we've got steering groups, and that's just the way it works. It's regulated sector, there's a lot of governance, but we use them to our advantage to do this expectation setting. We use them to help us kind of provide that layer of shielding to our teams, if you like. We increased the transparency with them, so we brought them along with us, and we were actually quite transparent about the problems we were having or the small wins that we had, and it let us connect with them. And then what we did was we started to establish some regular demos, which even by the end of the year, we've still got our CEO coming along to those demos on a regular basis, and he quite likes that connection with the teams. The other thing I had to do was build trust. So in that slide I just showed you before, there was a lot of kind of them and us and silos and things, and we had to build some trust, but all through the organisation. So we had to build it with that steering group and the senior leadership team. We had to build it with the business teams into the tech teams, and the tech teams into the business teams. We had to actually look at how our technical teams were working and potentially challenge them to change their ways of working. And we had to build some trust just between the individual teams themselves. So there was a lot of patience. And if you think about human nature, we just had to, it's one step forward and a couple of steps back sometimes. But that was the job I took on this year. And then the kind of last part was challenging those perceptions. So a lot, not for us, there's, you know, this won't work and all this thing. So we actually challenged people to just go with us for a little while, and then we started kind of off with that clean slate, which really helped. But the main thing that I did this year was set that clear goal. So how are we going to align everybody to the same thing? And if you could go on to the next slide, I've written what that goal was. So what we talked about at the start of the year was, by the end of 2021, can we get to the stage where we're releasing smaller, more incremental changes? Can we start to review and adapt our approach as we learn and understand more? And then how can we safely scale so that we've got more capacity to deliver more change across our portfolio? And what we all kind of came to the common understanding was we had to break down those silos. We had to work as one team. So on the next slide, that's a really quick slide though, really the question was, what was the key to that? Was it going to be Scrum? Was it going to be Safe? Was it going to be Kanban? Actually, it was none of them. And if you go on to the next slide, in my view, the key was the people. So it was about how did we get people actually coming along with us in this journey and talking to each other. So if we go back to inclusion and we go on to the next slide again, if you think about it, the key to bringing people along in this journey was about people feeling included and actually feeling that they wanted to do this. So we looked at how could we make sure that people could participate if they wanted to and when they were ready. So when we put out a lot of the invites, it was the start of 2021, people were back in lockdown again. Change is scary in normal times, but people were working from home and they didn't maybe have that person just to have a moan to or have a rant at because they didn't like something, and but we're just getting generally fed up. So if we were going to successfully lead this change, we had to really think of how could we let people participate on their terms. So we made our invites open, and they were just a open invite, anyone can attend. Sessions were all recorded, and they could either participate or listen. And we also created kind of channels out the back of that to let people ask questions offline as well as part of the meetings, because again, not everyone was comfortable doing that. We also looked at kind of what was our language that we were using and kind of thinking about communication styles. So quite quickly, if you think about it, our technical teams were talking about, we're using lots of jargon, if you like, from a tech perspective. So we're talking about their velocity, or we've got a refinement meeting, or we've got a stand up and all this sort of thing. Our business teams equally were talking about, we've got to think about the AUM, and we've got to think about the SR report and all this stuff that I didn't understand. We had to get to a place where everybody could actually, from everything we were talking about. So we started doing things like asking people, what does that mean? And actually being quite open about it to say, if you're not sure about something, let's talk about actually what we're talking about and get to a place where I kind of call it dinner table conversation, but could you sit down with your family at dinner and tell them what you did at work without having to explain the terms? So how can we kind of get that common language across everybody? And then the kind of final couple of points there were about learning. So how can we get a sustainable pace that let people have time to learn in a way that worked for them? And again, it's thinking back to people who are working from home. So how do you make sure that they've got enough time to actually do their job and learn and still ask questions and all that sort of stuff? So how do you create that balance? So if you can move on to the next slide, please. I started thinking about then, how do we set those realistic expectations, right? We talked about that at the start. One team, everyone's part of the journey, but change takes time and we all make mistakes. So how do we do that? So on the next slide, I'll tell you a couple of things that I tried to do. Sorry, that's tiny. That's my fault for trying to take too much on a slide. But what we did with this was at the start of the year, we ran a ways of working workshop, which was remote. It was over a couple of days. We recorded our sessions and we invited everybody that didn't have to attend if they didn't want to. And we covered just the basics of the more agile ways of working that we wanted to think about this year. We assumed no prior knowledge and we talked about roles and responsibilities. So we kind of tried to set that ground level, but we also then shared the technical agile training sessions that we have available in Confluence for our tech teams with everybody, so that if they wanted to watch them, they could. And then the transparency I've talked about. So we worked with the steering group and we helped them to understand a bit more about what we're doing. But we started to set up a portfolio demo that we ran every 2 weeks. And every team in the portfolio came and shared the good and the not so good about what they were doing. And they gave a demo if they could. And they've continued throughout the year. And they've actually been quite popular and a really useful tool just to make sure that everyone sees what's going on. We also encourage our business teams to present at those demos, so it's not just technical teams. So if maybe we've got a change that's very operationally heavy, they'll come along and they'll share what they're doing and make sure that everyone's up to speed. If you go on to the next slide, please. We then talked about trust and people having the trust and knowing that they're doing the right things and that they can make their own decisions. And if everyone understands the process and the role that they've got in it, you get higher quality deliveries. So to build that trust, if you go on to the next slide, you'll start to see a theme here, Gary. There's 2 slides for every topic. To do that, we mixed our team with our teams building the products. That might sound obvious to some people, depending on where you work, but that wasn't happening. And it's been an interesting one because I think we're now finally getting there, but there's a bit of resistance to that at the start, and it has taken that year for things to really start to change. We also, that one there again talks about the portfolio demos, which helped to build the trust because it was sharing things openly, and we created an environment where people could constructively challenge what was going on. So we've really upped that communication piece, from demos right the way up to steering group, just to the data's there. We've got dashboards, we've got different things. Come and let us show you what we're building. And we've really built the trust up just through conversation and communication. If you go on to the next slide, the last big thing I was trying to do, and I like this picture because it's a bit challenging perceptions. So in this picture, you'll see my husband, who's 6'5", and my daughter, who's about 5 foot, at the Camera Obscura in Edinburgh, showing you that you have to think about the perception of what you're seeing, because obviously she looks like she's a lot taller, a lot bigger than he is, and the perception was at that time there was always tech that were wrong, and from a business perspective, they were always just tech was always late. Sorry. And then from a technical perspective, the business couldn't make up their mind and they kept changing things. So they weren't late, they were just doing what they were asked. So we had to change that perception and actually get the teams to work together. Oh, it's okay, you can go on to the next one now if you like. So to do that again, I ran weekly drop-in sessions to start to just create a space for people to talk or cover specific topics. So if you wanted to understand more about what were we doing in this team, come along and ask and let's have the conversation. And it was trying to create that informal conversation, albeit it was the same hour every week. as a drop-in session. And we tried to reduce the number of last-minute changes by getting the people in one team so that we weren't having people given a requirement, a team going and building something in a sprint and then come back and someone going, no, that's not right. It was very much, we are one team. And I know this, again, like I said, it sounds a bit obvious, depends on where you're working, but again, it's about working in the environment that you're in, making the small changes to start to make some improvements. But if you could go on to the next slide, please. Just to come back to the goals that we talked about at the start. So at the start of this year, I had set myself 3 goals. And it turns out to releasing smaller incremental changes, we're not quite there yet. We completely underestimated the complexity of the biggest delivery that we had this year. But next year, we're set up now to move to monthly releases, and don't roll your eyes at that. That's a massive step change for some of these teams. But we do have some teams who are releasing every 2 weeks, which is amazing in the environment that they're in. So we're continually building on it, and we're now releasing in a safer way. And we're starting to introduce technology that lets us have a bit more control. So how can we do our own releases rather than being dependent on other people doing the releases for us and going into bigger monthly or even quarterly releases. For the second one, review and adapt our approach. We're doing it. We're adapting all the time. We have regular retros in our teams, not so good at the portfolio-wide ones, and we'll pick that up again next year. They went really well at the start of the year and fell away just as we got very busy, so we do need to pick that one back up. And then for the last one, about how we safely scale our delivery, we've gone from 3 teams to approximately 9, and it's been bumpy, but we're starting to see the teams stabilise and settle and actually really form into teams. So again, next year is how do we focus on that fine tuning? And from a silo perspective, they're crumbling. They're not quite smashed, but they're on the way. We're about to release our biggest product launch this year, and the team have really pulled together across business and technology to get it out the door. So we are starting to see step changes in how people are working. If you go to the next slide. Personally, for me though, this year has been loads of progress and equally lots of setbacks. It's been emotionally draining. Trying to, I'm quite invested in what we're doing, and trying to bring people along with you on a change journey is draining. And it's been a step change in my career. So it's been difficult, but great fun at the same time. I've made a lot of new connections, learned a lot about financial advice. I didn't think I would, but equally that was because we were trying to get that kind of common language. And I've been challenged and inspired by the people that we're working with. I think the one thing that I would say is people never ever fail to surprise you when you start these things. So I'm quite proud of what we've done this year, and I can't wait to see how next year we can learn more and stabilise and reiterate. So if you go to the next slide, which is my second last slide, you'll be pleased to hear, just to kind of leave you with a couple of small things that maybe you could take away and think about. The main things that I'm thinking about to include people is creating the space and time to let people ask questions, and don't underestimate how much people actually appreciate you doing this. I think a lot of it is there's never such a thing as a daft question, and how do you make people feel comfortable enough to ask you what's on their mind? Use less jargon. And I was talking about dinner table test earlier, but could you sit down with family or friends and actually talk about what you're doing without having to explain everything? Never assume. So again, if you're trying to include everybody, never assume anything and make sure you're asking lots and lots of questions. And then a big one for me from an inclusion perspective is think about your communication style. So how do you engage a wider audience? Not everybody likes the same way of getting information given to them or participating in workshops. So really think about how does that work for people, and how can you maybe make small changes to help make it a bit more inclusive for folk. If you go on to the last slides, please, Gary. The main thing I'd like to take away is change doesn't happen overnight. So it's a process that takes time and a lot of patience, and you go backwards as well as forwards. And the one thing I've learned is you need to be kind to yourself while you're doing it as well. Because if you're trying to take people along with you in a change, you need to maintain that kind of passion and enthusiasm for what you're doing, and be there for people who are maybe struggling with with what you're trying to do. So that'd be my main takeaways. I'd love to talk more about it, so any questions and things, but for now, thank you for listening to what I had to say. I feel like I can now maybe take a breath and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was great. Really enjoyed that. Does anyone have any questions? If you're going to speak, though, you're going to have to take yourself off mute because I muted you all at one point.
There's one in the chat, actually. You mentioned that some in the business were reluctant to adopt Agile, and you asked them to go with it for a while. Was it ultimately the experience of Agile or successful delivery that changed their minds, or something else? That's an interesting question. I think it's a bit of a mix, to be honest. I'm not sure that many of them had experienced Agile before. I think they were used to working in a lot more of a traditional type way, and they were just quite cynical. This was something that happened over there rather than in their area, and they were quite happy. And people tend to not like change. I think we underestimate that all the time. So yeah, a lot of it was trying to get people to trust you when you haven't kind of earned that trust yet is difficult at the start of the journey as well. So we had a lot of support from senior leaders within our portfolio, which was partly based on the previous delivery that had been successful, but the people who were actually going through the change hadn't been part of that.
Can I ask, that was really good. I love that you're saying just people are always people, because it just always comes down to that. Can I ask what you had in the training sessions, the Agile training ones that you made available, like outside the tech team? What kind of things did you cover in those?
So we've got a mixture. So Suzanne Morrison, who a lot of people know who I work with, she's very involved in the Edinburgh Agile meetup. She had recorded a lot of training sessions for our tech teams, things like how to run a retrospective, or what does sprint planning look like, what does a product owner do, things just, they might seem quite basic stuff, but we use them quite often as an onboarding tool. If we maybe got some grads join our teams or things, have a watch of these, and then you'll start to understand how our teams work. And we thought, well, why shouldn't we share the tech training with everybody if they want to watch it? Because it's always helpful if you can understand at least how the teams are trying to work. So I was a kind of mixture, and most of them she'd recorded were like half an hour long sessions, so they weren't really long. They were quite digestible for people, and I think actually they just quite liked the fact that we shared them. I'm not sure, do you know what I mean? To be perfectly honest, it's just that we're not hiding anything here. Have a look. We even shared links to, like, we use Jira, and we shared the links to the boards, and go in and have a look and see what we're doing. We're not, if we were in an office, we would have it all up on the wall, but you couldn't. So it was just trying to be quite open with people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, this is Jira. It's not too scary. This is just what it is. Well, it is. But,
it is what it is, exactly. It was more just, that's what we're using. So you're welcome to go in and see it. We've actually managed to get, by the end of this delivery, I think we've got about 4 of our kind of key business people now joining our scrums that we have every morning with all the teams that are contributing to the big delivery that we've got going out the door. And they are now equally happy to raise defects on Jira just as much as our teams are, which is great, but equally can be quite frustrating for like, where's that defect come from? Who raised that? Why is that there? But it's nice that they're just now an honorary member of our stand-ups and feel quite comfortable.
Nice. No, that sounds really good.
I've got a question.
Oops. So go for it.
Thank you. Thanks, Caroline. That was very nice, especially because it has a lot of people centricity elements and inclusivity and all that. The question is, you mentioned at the start that when you guys started, there is a lot of people that are cynical on this, right, and are skeptical, and that's just by nature of change. How do you normally tackle those cohorts of people? Do you leave them, or do you force them to be part of the change, or do you just forget about them for a while? How have you seen that working for you guys?
Okay, we were quite lucky, so I would never force anybody to do that. I don't think you're going to get to where you want to be. But we were quite lucky in that we were starting. So at the start of the year, what I was trying to scale was to deliver this product that we're about to launch. And we were able to almost pick the early adopters to really be the key people as part of this. And we started to use their enthusiasm just by, oh, we're doing this. And the word spread in that way. So rather than force everybody to come along, we kind of took that read on who do we think would be a good fit to start with this, because we know this is not going to happen just this year. Even when we started at the beginning of January, we knew that it's going to take years to get to the stage where we've got our teams running the way we really want them to run. So that was the way that we tried it. Yeah, and I'm not sure that forcing people would have been, it's even harder when you're not sitting beside people either. So if someone starts to disengage and they're remote, it's really difficult to then bring them back. And just starting, I went in there with, I didn't know the people in the portfolio either. So it was a completely new business area for me. So it wasn't even like I had previous relationships to almost, oh, well, okay, you know that we'll get there with this, because you know we've worked together in the past. We didn't have any, well, I didn't have any of that. So again, it was just trying to read, albeit from a distance, who might be the better people to help us. And it's worked and it's not worked, right? You always get some people right and some people wrong, but we're getting there.
And sorry, follow up on that. Do you think that then the people that are the more cynical side of the spectrum, do you think that they organically they become a converter, someone that has been converted, or with time they will?
So we're starting to see more people come around to it, because what we've shown them is it's not about not following the governance. It's not about trying to get round documentation or not following the risk process that we've got. It's just about doing it in a different way and approaching things differently. So I think the fact that, like, the people who maybe have been slightly more cynical at the start would have been risk, compliance, people like that, but we have been very transparent all the way through. And the risk opinion that we got for the launch that we're about to do was really good. It was, and it highlighted the, you've worked with us from the beginning, we've known exactly what's going on, we've seen it as you've built it, we've been part of the conversations. So again, it's just I don't think you'll ever have everybody saying it's a good thing, because someone's always going to be like, but this happened and that wouldn't have happened if we had done it the other way. But I've just kind of tried to take the positive, because like I said, I found it quite an emotionally draining year, because you're having to be that positive person the majority of the time, which again can be quite difficult when you're hearing always that's not going to work, I don't like this, I don't want to do that. So again, it's just trying to draw on the positivity of the people that are enjoying it.
Thank you.
Joe, do you still have the question?
Yeah, it's same ballpark as Saul's, but it may be a different focus. You mentioned at the start when you were trying to get engagement that you ran some sessions where you talked about roles and responsibilities and things like that. I was wondering if you are allowed to share what caused the most friction out of the things there? Was there a particular practice or role that was like maybe controversial or caused at least the most friction that you saw?
Do you know what? It's a good question, because we're literally talking about roles and responsibilities for next year, for the next piece of work that we're starting to kick off. And it's the same pieces that are causing the same friction. So where I'm seeing a lot of the friction is not so much from the technical delivery teams. I think the remit's quite clear. You're going to, ultimately, we are accountable for delivering the technology, and we want to help you solve the problems, but you need to be able to tell us what your problems are, is the way to deal with our business. But if you think about the product owner and our business kind of subject matter experts, and being an advice business, we have people who are very specialist in what they do, and it's that role that can be quite interesting. And then you put some BAs into the mix there as well, and there's just a lot of people who are, it's almost like that kind of vector diagram where they're all treading in the same sort of area. And the question I keep asking at the moment is, who's going to make the decision about what we're going to build? Who is it that's getting measured on the benefits of what we're delivering? and therefore as the person who makes that choice about we want to build X before Y, just to give some direction, because we can take all that input from every SME, but they'll all have slightly different opinions, and who's the decision maker at the end of the day. And I don't think we've still not got an answer for our teams, but what we had a couple of weeks ago actually was a very healthy discussion around it, which we didn't have at the start of the year. So people are at least willing now to see that they're not being challenged for not having a place in the team. It's actually more now about what's your responsibility in that team, not are you going to be in the team? Because at the start of the year, I think people thought technology's coming in, we're going to work Agile, they're taking over. And it's not about that. It's about actually how do we pull everybody together and make it a bigger team. That's how we tried to tackle it. But I'd be interested to hear actually if anyone else has seen the same sort of thing, because it's one thing I've not been able to really get my head around for a long time, to be honest. Even in like previous companies, it's always been a bit of an interesting question.
Cool, thank you.
So you seen the same sort of thing, or do you? I know like it's slightly different setup, but it's still people at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's the bit that always makes it fun and not repeatable, right? And you got to keep trying different things, right? And experiment, see what works. You generally know some things, but you learn new things as well, don't you? It's what makes it interesting. But there's always something that creates friction where you're going up against the current establishment for how things get done. And decision making is a big one, right? As in who actually gets to make the calls for these things. Perhaps the teams do it themselves, or it was always one person that got their way, right? But that usually messes up scheduling if you do that as well. So yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, we're definitely not quite at the teams get to make their decisions like completely on what they're building. What we're trying to do is at least give them the power to work out when they build things and what's the best way to tackle things, but we're not there yet. Maybe one day.
Any more questions or thoughts here? Okay,